We're going to get started here. It's 8 o'clock. I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers this morning. I'm actually going to do it one at a time. So we are going to hear about the emergence of the mind at birth, death, instinct, and knowledge. We have Dr. Alessandro Massetta, who's going to speak first. So I'm going to introduce him. He's going to come up and speak, and then I will get up and introduce Dr. Daniela Polesi when it's her turn to speak. So Dr. Alessandro Massetta, he's currently working as a psychiatrist at I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, but Villa Maria Pia Psychiatric Private Hospital in Rome, Italy. Dr. Massetta graduated in medicine at the University of Rome, Sapienza, with a thesis on the territorial organization of the Psychiatric National Service in Italy and in France, summa cum laude. He did his residency, let's see, sorry, I lost my place here. He studied the theoretical approach of Professor Massimo Fagioli in order to be a psychotherapist. He's currently part of a study group on the psychotherapy of psychosis together with Dr. Daniela Polesi and Dr. Eva Gebhardt. Interestingly, he also graduated as a double bass player at the Conservatory of Turin, Giuseppe Verdi. So it is with pleasure to have you come up here, Dr. Massetta. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you to the Academy for the invitation. Where does human thinking come from? When and how does it start? This paper focuses on a research finding that we consider to be fundamental for mental health. It considers the functioning of the human mind from a different point of view, so that a therapy for mental illnesses can be proposed. We are all aware of what the fetus reality in the womb is. It is possible to imagine a condition before birth. Complete darkness, silence, the warm amniotic fluid that surrounds and protects the fetus in a condition of homeostasis, defending it from every external variation. But what happens at birth? We would like to highlight how suddenly everything changes. Let us think a condition after birth. The newborn suddenly finds himself or herself in the external natural world, which is full of intolerable stimuli. In particular, the newborn is subjected to a real bombardment of stimuli called noise, air, and light. And light is an absolutely new stimulus compared to the darkness of the intrauterine environment. In this situation, the newborn's absence of reaction is not conceivable. For instance, the main characteristic of living organisms is their ability to respond to external stimuli. Thus, when the newborn is first exposed to light, he or she must have a reaction to this completely new stimulus. Light is energy that can reach the retina directly by crossing the eyes and the pupillary space. The reaction of the retina should be instantaneous. From an anatomic point of view, the retina is part of the diencephalon, which is the posterior subdivision of the forebrain. Thus, we can assert that light can come into direct contact with the cerebral matter. So, the newborn's first relationship is not with a human environment, but rather with an inanimate and non-human world. In particular, the first stimulus is not air, but light. everybody may have had the chance to see how a baby is born and seen how, in the very first few seconds after birth, the baby does not breathe or cry. There is a variable time, around 20 seconds, when the newborn baby's body is characterized by hypotonia. For instance, during this short period of time, the newborn is still not breathing or moving. He or she does not seem to be alive. After this first few seconds, the baby starts breathing, moving, and crying, and is said to be born. This basic observation constitutes the premises of what has been defined as human birth theory, a theory that was first formulated in 1971 by the Italian psychiatrist Massimo Fagioli. Based on these aspects, Fagioli theorized about the brain activation at birth through a deductive method. According to this theory, every human being has equal capabilities and equal potential to grow and develop. For instance, at birth, reaction to light is the same in all human beings. In particular, the author considered that the brain's reaction to light triggers the activities of the body and simultaneously those of the mind. Remarkably, Fagioli spoke of non-conscious mind, which is there as early as birth, rather than consciousness or unconscious as Freud did. The analysis of recent literature data has highlighted how human birth theory correlates with several findings in physiology. Moreover, the activity of intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells may suggest an additional essential function of the retina, which is strictly connected to survival rather than vision. But what does the newborn baby's first relation with light entail? What happens in those few seconds of silence at birth? The body of the fetus does no longer exist, which is supported by the biological modifications that have been observed, such as those in blood circulation and hemoglobin. Furthermore, human beings' reaction to light at birth consists in a physical reaction that initiates a first mental activity. For instance, the activity of the mind begins as the reaction of the body to light by making the external inanimate world disappear. Fagioli defined this reaction as annulment pulsion, which at birth, given the involvement of vitality, is disappearance fantasy. Through this dynamic, human thinking starts. The annulment pulsion is physiological at birth and is aimed at making the external inanimate world disappear together with the newborn's coming to light. Fagioli wrote, "The annulment pulsion directed against the world in the same instant creates vitality that is movement. Together with the creation and the existence of the new body, the newborn baby's body, the time of life starts." The newborn's movement at birth does not refer to a movement in space, but it is an internal movement aimed at finding an interhuman relationship and is due to the capability to imagine, which is there at birth. For instance, through vitality, the newborn, who has mnemic traces of the skin's previous contact with the amniotic fluid, makes the image of the existence of another human body emerge as memory. So he or she realizes the hope certainty that another human being exists. In his Death Instinct and Knowledge, Fagioli wrote, "We have, therefore, two concepts. One, fantasy wish to return to a previous stage. Two, annulment, disappearance of the neonatal condition. Once the fact that the tendency wish to return to a previous stage can only be realized as fantasy has been made plain, we can, or rather must, conceptualize that the annulment of the condition that is currently being experienced is also realized as fantasy. It can be assumed that the first fantasy of the human being is the disappearance fantasy." Fagioli formulated his theory based on the psychotherapeutic and psychiatric clinical work with mentally ill patients. He deduced that unhealthy interhuman relationship in patients' early life should have caused a loss of vitality, thereby making the annulment pulsion arise in them. When it occurs throughout life, the annulment pulsion is no longer physiological as it is at birth, but pathological. For instance, the annulment pulsion is caused by the loss of vitality and is directed against pathogenic interhuman relationships. The annulment pulsion is a sort of interior blackout whereby at a non-conscious level the other is made to disappear, is made non-existent as if he or she had never existed. This leads to a further impoverishment of vitality so that a pathological circle is initiated. The relationship with one's own mother is usually involved in this process, in particular during the first few years of life. It is remarkable to observe that this pathophysiological process occurs in postnatal period and not at the prenatal stage. For instance, if the newborn baby has not been sufficiently nourished in terms of affectivity and love, disappointment will lead him or her to enact the annulment pulsion against the other, that which will be particularly compromised in his or her hope certainty there exists a valid interhuman relationship. Thus, the newborn develops an internal condition which is characterized by a serial lack of affectivity. This condition may remain hidden for some time, and then later in life, during adolescence, it may develop into a mental disorder. For instance, during adolescence, the non-conscious mind suddenly wakes up, and if something was lacking, if there have been failures, losses, empty relationship in the first few months and years of life, this will inevitably re-emerge during puberty. The role of psychiatrists and psychotherapists is to grasp whether the changes in thinking occurring at this stage of human development are physiological and will disappear with the shaping of an adult identity, or whether they are somehow pathological and doomed to persist and turn into an illness that can fall under the different classic definition of hysteria, obsessive neurosis, psychopathic personality, depression, or schizophrenia. Human birth theory may lead to consider mental illnesses as pathology stemming from unhealthy human relationship taking place immediately after birth and during the first few years of life. A psychotherapy that is based on a non-conscious relationship can recreate the mind's characteristics at birth, in particular with the interpretation of dreams, which again, in this approach, differs from Freud's interpretation of dreams. Starting from this new psychiatric perspective, psychotherapy can be a valuable therapeutic strategy and a highly effective therapy at an early stage of several mental illnesses, such as psychosis, which in most cases have been regarded to be incurable. In conclusion, the idea about the human mind being originally healthy and not characterized by a primal autistic or chaotic condition may set the basis for an idea of curability of mental illnesses. Moreover, the finding about human being common reaction to light at birth implies thinking about an initial condition of equality for everyone, which implies a fundamental conception of human beings, their equality beyond cultural or somatic differences, a conception that could contribute to the eradication of any form of racism. Thank you.
Oh my God. I was just trying to look. Okay. We're going to do questions at the end. So before we do that, I'm going to ask Dr. Pugliese to come up. So first, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a psychiatrist, an individual and group psychotherapist in Rome, Italy. She works in the psychiatric ward of the University Hospital Sant'Andrea at the University of Rome Sapienza in Rome. She has been professor on contract and seminar professor at the residency program in psychiatry and at the residency program in gynecology and obstetrics of the School of Medicine at University of Naples in Federico II, Naples, Italy. She's also a curator of the Italian version of Arietti's interpretation of schizophrenia and of Horowitz and Wakefield's Loss of Sadness. She graduated in painting at the Academy of Fine Arts in Rome. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pugliese.
Thank you, Joanna, for your introduction, and thanks to the Academy for having invited me. Okay. The concept that one has of how the unconscious works is crucial in the practice of psychodynamic psychotherapy. As our objective is to draw psychodynamic psychotherapy to psychiatry, which is a medical discipline, we could use the term physiology, from Greek physis, nature, to refer to the natural functioning of the unconscious. We can thus infer the existence of a corresponding physiopathology to refer to the loss of such natural functioning and to a therapy that can restore it. Today, I would like to highlight that what we regard to be an advance and innovation in the field of psychodynamic psychotherapy. Traditionally, in psychodynamic psychotherapy, there is a shared consensus on the concept of unconscious as Freud defined it. For instance, Freud defined the unconscious as a chaos of primitive and perverted partial drives, going as far as considering children's unconscious as the unconscious that expresses itself in the most extreme way. In particular, in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud defined children as polymorphous, perverse, narcissistic, and autoerotic, as being unable to relate with the external environment and the human beings. The authors who came after him and criticized him by moving away from his basic ideological precepts did not completely reject this concept. For instance, over the past few decades, in the field of psychodynamic psychotherapy, there has been an increasing interest in object relations. These have been essentially based on behavior, thus preventing further research into the unconscious. For example, we can recall, amongst others, Hartman and his ego psychology in the 50s. Indeed, no theory was ever formulated that could question the Freudian concept of unconscious. Melanie Klein theorized about newborns' schizoid paranoid condition until 3 to 4 months of age, Bion introduced the role of psychotic personality. Mahler spoke about normal autism and a constitutional psychophysical splitting in human beings. The biological birth of the human infant and the psychological birth of the individual are not coincident in time. What if the birth of the human mind coincided with the birth of the human body? Unlike what was stated by Otto Rank, who tried to carry out research into human birth in his The Trauma of Birth, in 1926 Freud wrote, "There is much more continuity between intrauterine life and earliest infancy than the impressive caesura of the act of birth would have us believe. In this scheme of things, there is no place for the abreaction of the trauma, of the birth trauma." Now, I would rather not dwell on any criticism of or express my views about these positions, but rather carry out the epoche Husserl was so fond of, and consider a new thought in psychodynamic psychotherapy. As you have heard from the previous presentation, in 1972, Death, Instinct and Knowledge by Massimo Fagioli, a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and psychotherapist, was first published in Italy. The book has been recently translated into English, and you can find it for any reference at the desk in the hall. In the foreword to the first edition of the book, the author wrote, "Presenting myself to colleagues and to an increasingly greater number of enthusiasts of psychoanalysis with a book undoubtedly requires courage. Psychoanalysis has reached such a deep and broad level of knowledge and concepts as to make it extremely difficult to keep abreast of all others' studies and publications. My efforts in taking part in current analytic debate are coupled with my efforts, which are essential, in continuously reviewing and elaborating the fundamental texts. It may sound a priori outrageous to add oneself to the list of those who, instead of limiting themselves to listening and learning, wish to be listened to as they think they may have something to say. This action, which might easily be dismissed as being useless and annoying, is basically justified by two reasons. One, the relevance I could give to an unconscious fantasy, which I have never found clearly mentioned in books or in discussions amongst colleagues, although many, or rather a huge number of fundamental psychoanalytic concepts make reference to it. I am referring to what I have defined as the disappearance fantasy. Two, the second reason, which I find more difficult to explain, is on the one hand the desire for and the need to have a platform from which to start, meaning an organic, consequential, and as far as possible coherent discourse on the basis of which I might then discuss and elaborate single issues, which could only be done by expounding concepts in the form of a book. And on the other, the desire to describe how my research and therapy are oriented towards a global approach to the human psyche. So please refer to the foreword in first edition of the book for any further reference. Thus, Fagioli theorized that a human mind forms at birth. Contrary to what has been considered to be true so far, according to Fagioli, biological birth coincides with the psychological birth. Newborn's reaction to the external environment is immediate and biologically determined, as the brain's reaction to light. The newly formed mind reacts with pulsion, thereby making that which is inanimate disappear. Newborns react to the external non-human environment, drawing on their vitality. Their physical vitality, which is measured based on their ability to react with the APGAR score, is linked to their mind's vitality. This does not result in newborn's autistic closure, but rather in the creation of an image, which derives from the contact the fetus's skin had with amniotic fluid, and the newborn's capability to imagine, which the author defined with the German term Vorstellungsvermögen. This is a universal species-specific characteristic and is there as from the very first few instants of life, as early as birth. Based on patients' dreamlike images, this image has been first defined by the author as unconscious calm sea, and is the expression of the mnestic trace of the contact the fetus's skin had with the warm and calm amniotic fluid. This allows newborns to hope, be certain there exists another body, another human being like themselves. Newborns realize their own existence, and with that, the certainty that there is a breast. According to human birth theory, it is through pulsion, the so-called annulment pulsion, that newborns realize the disappearance of the external non-human world, whilst simultaneously making themselves disappear. However, their vitality makes the capability to imagine arise in them, thus making them form an image. After they have realized this image, this will draw them towards the external animate and human world, which is similar to the trace they have onto their skin, and newborns will actively search for the breast. This is the reason why in 2016, Fagioli wrote that newborns can be left alone for up to 12 hours. Then, just as they will have to be physically nourished, they will need for another human being. This human being will allow them to develop their capabilities and qualities within the relationship. Human beings know material reality, meant as mind, as thought, is physiologically fused with their material reality, their body, and this is true as early as birth. Thus, newborns are endowed with a natural tendency towards interhuman relationships with intersubjectivity. After they have been in a relation with the other, or at the end of every suckling, newborns will separate with the memory fantasy of the experience they have had, and will increase their vitality and develop new internal images, which will combine so as to develop human beings' initial self at birth. Through the relationship with the other in the first year of life, the qualities that are there as early as birth will grow with the body, thus allowing the mind to develop until a complete psychic identity, which can be immune to mental diseases, is achieved at weaning. However, if the person the newborn relates to is disappointing, the newborn's original vitality, instead of increasing, diminishes. This may lead to non-physiological dynamics such as newborns addressing the annulment pulsion against the human world, the breast, others, their own affections. This dynamic will result into the lack of affectivity. This psychodynamic approach demands that therapists take responsibility toward their patients, given that they act as physicians to treat in order to cure an illness. By acknowledging a primal physiologically healthy mental condition, psychotherapists have the role to help patients recreate it through an interhuman relationship within setting that should differ from the unconscious relationship that contributed to the onset of the disease. This requires that psychotherapists get actively involved in the therapeutic relationship. That should not remain silent, but rather express their presence through interpretation continuously. Psychotherapists should interpret transfers and dreams, and do that in an unconventional way. For instance, based on this psychotherapeutic approach, dreams are not to be interpreted via free associations. Psychotherapists should interpret the patient's unconscious annulment pulsion in the dreams and in the setting, annulment pulsions that aims at making the psychotherapeutic work. After every week, and after the summer in particular, work that has been carried out disappear, while confirming patients' valid images whenever they appear. This will allow psychodynamic psychotherapists to slowly but continuously draw patients toward reality, which differs from patients' negations, projections, and identifications. This way, they will wait together with patients for the reappearance of the image at birth and the vitality patients have lost, which represent the fundament of original intersubjectivity. Thank you for your attention. And now I have the honor to introduce the next presentation by Francesca Fagioli. Joanne asked me to do it as she is not here because she couldn't come, but she gently sent us a professional video where she is reading her presentation. Francesca Fagioli is a psychotherapist, individual and group psychotherapist. She works in National Health Service in a service for early intervention on psychosis. She works on adolescents, patients, and she is a professor in the school of psychotherapy based on human birth theory named BIOS MCK. And she has also a PhD on early intervention on psychosis.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you for your kind invitation. I'm really sorry for not being there. The paper I'm going to read has been written with the kind contribution of my colleague Gianfranco De Simone. In the methodology of the research into the unconscious mind developed by Massimo Fagioli, the study of the psychic reality and of psychopathology is carried out within the therapeutic relationship, in a dynamic relational perspective to be intended as identification of those movements of the mind, of images and affections, which during one's own development and within one's own relationships may have altered and thus jeopardized the achievement of the subject's original identity. Based on Fagioli's theoretical premises, the origin of mental diseases is to be set in early experiences and one's first interpersonal relationships. This highlights how linking the term disease to the term mind occurs for a theoretical approach that does not consider psychopathological expressions to be the consequence of the lesion of one single function. Rather, they are the alteration, the lack, or the loss of that original psychophysical unity of human beings at birth, which is characterized by one's own activity and capability to act, capability to imagine, or memory, which all together characterize the first nucleus of self. Now I'd like to read you a few lines from Fagioli's book Death, Instinct and Knowledge. In the analytic setting, there exists a specific interpersonal situation that is not usually taken into account in other human relationships. The transference and content-transference relationship is outlined and accepted in the initial therapeutic contract. Afterwards, every interpretation will be based on this type of relationship. And all psychoanalysts know that frequently, or rather always, one of the main problems they must face is the behavioral or simply unconscious reaction of the patient when they cancel one or more sessions. The analyst is absent, the patient experiences frustration. So, from the first few lines of his book, Fagioli highlights how the concept of absence is to be intended as a psychological absence more than physical absence, meaning when, despite being physically there, the analyst is absent, does not comprehend or does not interpret correctly. And this disinterest, this absence is not the lack of something, but rather it is actively directing a pulsion against the external object. In this context, Fagioli thus considers the concept of frustration and links it to the concept of absence. Now let's try to explain how. First, we should consider frustration meant as opposing the patient's needs, as preventing the patient from satisfying his or her partial and isolated pulsions, because their direct satisfaction would lead the patient to introject the analyst, and thus to projective identification and a sadomasochistic relationship, where the analyst is turned into a persecutory phantom. In this case, the lack of frustration implies the analyst's positive absence. In this context, the term frustration binds with the term absence, as it corresponds to the analyst not getting involved in the satisfaction of a patient's need, meaning the patient expressing an isolated pulsion against the analyst. It is frustration absence, which is to be intended as the analyst's comprehension for and interest in the patient. We may say that in that sense the analyst is absent because he or she refuses the patient's split or partial dimensions of relationship. However, this does not mean being indifferent or neutral. Rather, by carrying out this counter-transferential dynamic, the therapist allows the patient to reintegrate his or her pulsions, which can thus be interpreted. We said frustration as opposing the patient's needs. Now the second one, frustration meant as opposing the patient's requirements. In this case, frustration becomes aggressiveness because the analyst should always satisfy the patient's requirements. By helping with interpretation, the patient listens and absorbs the analyst's words and care. The analyst should help the patient absorb the other's qualities through the introjection of the image and thought of the object analyst, rather than the introjection of the object. In this case, the lack of satisfaction becomes frustration, aggressiveness, meaning absence, which, as we said earlier, is to be intended as pulsion, aggressiveness, rather than the lack of something. Massimo Fagioli wrote about disappearance fantasy and unconscious calm sea in a typewritten volume that circulated amongst the members of SPI, Italian Association for Psychoanalysis, in Rome in 1971. It was the object of debate for its innovative theoretical contents and criticism of the inconsistencies of the classic theory. In That Instinct Knowledge, Fagioli described the discovery of a phenomenon that was verbalized with the oxymoron disappearance fantasy to indicate the capability of the original unconscious to imagine existence by annulling the stimulus of light as a reaction to and a defense against the physical external environment that is perceived as dangerous. Fagioli refused Freud's idea that there is no caesura at birth, just as he refused the idea that there is no scotoma and that there is only repression. He highlighted the immense caesura that exists between the darkness of the intrauterine condition and the light of the extrauterine reality. The disappearance fantasy as a reaction to a visual relationship which indisputably precedes the infant's relation with the breast determines the onset of an unconscious memory that differs from conscious recollections and that Fagioli defined as unconscious calm sea. Fagioli refused the idea based on which negative and destructive affections are the motor for onset of psychic reality. 50 years ago, human birth theory clearly established what is now a fact as it has been shown by development science and neonatology. Positive emotions, affections such as joy, the interest for, and surprise are fundamental for healthy mental development. For instance, they provide stimuli for exploration, interaction, and learning. The study of the process of birth has highlighted three basic aspects in Fagioli's theorization. First, the existence of an unrepressed unconscious that is much more original than the repressed unconscious, and it is present as early as birth. Second, the existence of a type of memory which is much more primitive than conscious recollections, that elaborates more archaic sensations and experiences that are linked to the great caesura of birth and newborn's first relationships. And third, the non-narcissistic relational nature of newborns, who can react to the external environment and the new stimulus, which is light, and are able to image the object in the relation. At the end of the first chapter of the Atheistic Knowledge, in a subchapter called A Case History, Fagioli described his clinical practice as it emerged from his psychotherapeutic relationship with a very severe psychotic patient. In there, Fagioli showed how theory and practice, or practice and theory, are inextricably linked to one another. Is it an idea, an intuition, which is then confirmed in the daily therapeutic practice of the relationship with patients that comes first? Or is it the actuality of the therapeutic relationship, the clinical practice, that makes thoughts arise and gives shape to them? In this subchapter, Massimo Fagioli, who was certain of his identity as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, dived into the dialectical therapeutic relationship, and he confirmed his theoretical thoughts in his daily therapeutic practice, never fearing confrontation with the patient's mental disease. Fagioli described how he had carried out a long individual analysis with a young man who was born because a child had died beforehand, and how the patient had managed to find his child again in the therapeutic relationship. This was also the case for thousands of people who attended Analisi Collettiva, a unique therapeutic practice which Fagioli carried out for more than 40 years. Fagioli's thought about human birth asserts original equality between men and women, blacks and whites, the face without physiognomy, that is the same in all human beings who, at birth, begin to move their mind in the same way. Thank you.
At this point, I would like to open it up to thoughts, questions, comments, and have some, yes, yeah.
So, I heard many times the word pulsion, but seeing that usually in the text we find other kind of words as drive or, for example, instinct. What's the difference between those three terms? So pulsion, drive, and instinct. And just this.
Okay, thank you for the question, because it's a fundamental, and it is a fundamental distinction between classical psychoanalytic text and human birth theory text. I think it's worth mention Freud's instincts and their vicissitudes, where he defined instinct as a constant force. In particular, he connects instinct and drive, which are synonymous for him, as they are genetically determined, and they are connected to needs. An instinctual stimulus is a need and must be satisfied to make it gone away. So instincts and drives are basically connected to needs and body survival, as thirst and hunger. So there is not basic distinction between animal instinct and human instinct traditionally. Okay, this distinction was not even made after Freud. He does not distinguish, as we have heard, by the reaction to other rank, human birth from animal birth. And for him, birth is a biological event which has no value from a biological point of view and no meaning from a psychological point of view. This was reiterated by philosophy too. For example, after inhibition symptoms and anxiety in 1926 by Freud was written by Martin Heidegger in 1927 in his Being and Time that human beings are thrown into the world at birth. So this is just a material happening. He said the word geworfenheit. It means thrown into the world. So there is no traditional distinction between human birth and animal birth. According to this human birth theory, there is a basic distinction that is the disappearance fantasy, because there is a specific reaction to the external environment. As the human beings, us, we are inept offspring. We cannot react to nature. On the contrary, animals go towards nature, while human beings react to nature, annulling it. And that is a big distinction. And they react also with a mental reaction, that is the disappearance fantasy. Okay, I think that is the basic distinction. Thank you.
I really, Alessandro and Daniela, I thought your presentations were terrific, and something I really think is important is your talk about how active the analyst needs to be in his or her work with these patients. And you also talk, and as did, is Francesca Fagioli Massimo's daughter? How she talked about her father's original concepts coming from working with psychotic patients, which struck me as the value of this, because one thing I think, you talk about philosophical progression of birth, but there's been a biological progression of understanding the fetal environment from 1970, which was when Fagioli was writing, till now. That's somewhat different, and I think you have to just be careful of saying that birth, that consciousness or awareness or sensation begins with the first breath, because there's pretty good biological evidence that it really begins probably with the first fetal heartbeat, whether we're talking about, usually with rats actually. So to talk about consciousness as beginning at birth, it's maybe philosophically it's okay, but biologically it's shaky ground. But I love the idea of you're talking about how active, especially with psychotic patients, and the psychotherapy of psychosis, which is underplayed in this world of psychopharm. The psychotherapy of a psychotic patient is critical, and I think some of the work you're pointing out here is really right on in terms of that world.
Thank you, Richard, for your precise and smart question, as usual. About psychotic patients, the difference in this approach is that with psychotic, it's possible to do psychotherapy as they can do transference. Because of this concept about unconscious, because psychosis is traditionally an emergency of unconscious to the consciousness, as the traditional concept of unconscious is psychotic. In this approach, the concept of unconscious is not psychotic, He is characterized by vitality and capability to image. So you have to change the psychotic condition, and you can do. You don't have just manage it, to control it, and to you know, it's not like superego, ego, and S. It's unconscious, which can be healthy or ill or sick, like in medicine. That's why I was saying about physiology, pathophysiology, and therapy. The second point, which is very, very interesting, is about this initial self at birth, which Fagioli has proposed. But he doesn't speak about an awareness or consciousness at birth. It's a mind that is not unconscious or conscious. It's a neonatal mind which is able to have a relationship with the external world. When consciousness comes, then we can do the distinction between unconscious and consciousness. But this neonatal mind, the mind of the birth at the first year of life, is pretty similar to unconscious. So it's not consciousness or awareness, it's unconscious. And a basic point is that we have also some demonstration. There are initial data about the difference between fetus condition and neonatal condition. It is a very important brain changes, and you have a functioning of the brain and a relationship with the external world and a reaction at birth, which is possible. For example, Ben-Ari discovered the change of GABA at birth. You know that we have two basic neurotransmitters, which are glutamate and GABA. They classically are respectively excitatory and inhibitory. And, but imagine that in the fetus condition, GABA is excitatory, while at birth we have this GABA shift. But we have no time, so I can conclude now. Thank you.
Thank you to both our all three of our speakers, but both of you who are here today. We do need to stop. I need to make an announcement. There's a panel tomorrow. Okay, thank you.